This presentation was created in March 2021 by a determined team who were separated due to COVID restrictions. All contributors prepared individually from remote workspaces and collaborated online. Of course, there were technical challenges, but we hope this will not diminish the essence of the powerful messages about race equality in education.
I'm delighted to be able to talk to you today about the work that we've been doing on equalities. I'm immensely proud of the approach that we've chosen to take, which is about that systemic change in leadership in race equality. Over the years, we've worked very hard on anti-racism, looking at areas of the curriculum and how we can support teachers to have inserts in the curriculum. But I think in 21st century, and particularly with Black Lives Matter, we need to capture that momentum and we need to look to our leaders. And that's leaders at all levels across the city. Myself, head teachers, heads of service, quality improvement officers, very importantly, young people. They need to be our leaders of the future. We need to be challenging race. We need to be challenging the stereotypical comments. We all need to be speaking out. And those responsibilities are so important if we're going to get that systemic change. And that's why we've called it systemic change in leadership. It's the tin of beans, it's what it says on the label. That's what we are going to do. And the work that we've been doing with CRER, I think, is central to all that. We're challenging the way people think. We need to learn to walk in other people's shoes. It's too easy sometimes for white managers, for white leaders to be able to say, oh, I've done this or I've done that. Let's not think about tokenism. This is about real change. And in order to effect real change, we need to walk in other people's shoes and we need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, have I done everything that I possibly could to be fair, to be equitable? Is my workforce that I manage reflecting the community that I serve? And just now, of course, it isn't. We need to make teaching, we need to make schools, working in our schools and nurseries, attractive to that very diverse range of community that we have across the city. And I'm delighted that now we're starting. We're starting with Black Lives Matter behind us. We're starting with our young people behind us, and we are going to change. Thank you for your part in all this.
The world. This last week I've been thinking about this Black Lives Matter thing and the horror show that was the murder of George Floyd. Now this is tricky for us in Dribbly because we're not the most diverse community, but you know, I don't think it matters where you're from. I think it matters that you do something about it, because Jesus would, wouldn't he? And listen, I'm aware that all lives matter, obviously. But until all lives matter the same, we're doing something very wrong. So I think we need to focus on justice for a huge chunk of our countrymen and women who seem to have a very bad, weird deal from the day they're born. So, follow me. I think that in Dibley, perhaps we should think about taking down some of these old notices like this and that. And perhaps we put up one like this instead.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Let's stand up against racism.
Black lives matter because they haven't mattered for 300 years. It's got to change now, and this is just the start.
The Black Lives Matter movement existed long before summer 2020, but after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, there was a groundswell in awareness of the movement and its aims around the world. Scotland was no exception, and for many young black and minority ethnic people in Scotland, this became the turning point for them to take action on the issues of racism and racial inequality facing them in their school lives. Young people are calling for schools to decolonise and diversify the curriculum, for more diversity in the teaching workforce, and for better approaches to tackling racist bullying. Whether through speaking out on social media, organising petitions, or forming their own anti-racist groups, young people are now asserting their right to an equally rewarding experience in education. Because as much as our schools might aspire to be inclusive, for too many young people, this is not the reality. The Black Lives Matter movement is necessary, because individuals and institutions often behave as if they don't. Here in Glasgow, Scotland's most diverse city, we have the opportunity to turn things around by taking leadership on race equality in our schools.
To create change, we need to understand the root causes and foundations of the thing that we're trying to change. In this video, we'll look at some key concepts around race and racism that you can use to take this work forward in your schools. In particular, we're going to look at racism as a structure that impacts all of our lives. You might find it helpful to think about this structure as having three layers: personal, social, and institutional. Personal racism is something that we're all aware of, at least in its most obvious sense. We know that some individuals have prejudiced attitudes and behaviours. We hear about celebrity racism scandals in the media, and it would be easy to think that racism is mainly about unpleasant behaviour carried out by unpleasant people. But actions that obviously stem from racism are only the tip of the iceberg. Nobody's born with racist attitudes and behaviours. These develop because the threads of racism are woven throughout our society. Racism is a social structure. What does that mean for us in Scotland? Racism occurs when the dominant ethnic group in a nation or region sees itself as superior, more important, or simply more normal than other ethnic groups. For the dominant group, people like us and the way we do things are given a degree of privilege and value. This means the power and influence in society remains with that dominant group. Prejudice exists in all communities, but this issue of power and influence means there's no such thing as reverse racism. Minority or non-dominant groups in society lack the power to oppress others on a large scale. Individual acts of anti-white behaviour can't change this in any meaningful way. Later in this video, we'll look further into this idea of racism as a social structure and how it affects us all. In the meantime though, let's talk about institutional racism. In any type of organisation, institutional racism is created when rules, customs, processes and practices have been planned without considering the potential impacts on people from minority ethnic groups. This may or may not coincide with directly racist actions on the part of an institution or its employees. The impacts of the institution's work and the way it operates are racist, regardless of whether the people within the institution have racist attitudes themselves. Within schools, not having a 100% clear picture of how to meet minority ethnic learners' needs and prevent or tackle racism can lead to institutional racism. But with a good understanding of how it works, you can guard against it. Lord William Macpherson defined institutional racism in his 1999 report on the Met Police's handling of the Stephen Lawrence murder inquiry. He described it as the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people. He said that it could be seen in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. To get a better idea of what this means, let's look at the three areas set out by Lord Macpherson: processes, attitudes and behaviours. In organisations of any kind, there are common examples of how processes reflect racism. It's common to see a low level of representation of minority ethnic people in the workforce, and this goes for the teaching workforce too, particularly in decision-making and senior roles. This creates a limited range of perspectives in decision-making, which becomes dominated by the perspectives of the most powerful group who hold these positions. This impacts on the organisation's policies and practices and who they serve best. It impacts who gets jobs, promotions and opportunities, and whose needs are prioritised most.
Education services and individual schools are all focused on meeting learners' needs and ensuring that all learners can do well in achievement, attainment and their experience at school. We know that we have to target extra support to those who need it in order to tackle any potential disadvantages. But if we think about how this works in practice, which kinds of disadvantage are most highly prioritised? Who makes these decisions and why? We know that in Scotland, particularly in Glasgow, poverty and socio-economic exclusion has been a huge priority for a long time. But when we think about learners that these issues affect, are we considering that poverty rates are twice as high in minority ethnic communities as they are in white communities? Scottish Government statistics show that minority ethnic families are the only one of their child poverty priority groups who are still seeing rising levels of poverty. And 2 of Glasgow's wards with the highest child poverty levels also happen to be some of the most diverse areas of the city. This one example shows that we need to think about the race equality implications in everything we prioritise, and that race equality needs to be a priority in itself.
Which kinds of challenges and disadvantages are most highly prioritised? Who makes these decisions and why?
Coming back to Lord Macpherson's focus on processes, attitudes and behaviours, how do attitudes reflect racism within an organisation? Everyone absorbs messages about race and this idea that the dominant group, in Scotland the majority ethnic group, are normal, average and unremarkable. They are made up of individuals and generally don't see themselves as a group. Within that group, there are people who are racist and those who aren't. We don't have any responsibility for racism if we aren't racists. These messages make it easy for white Scottish people to overlook racism in its real context, as a social structure we're all caught up in. On the other hand, people from minority ethnic groups are seen through a racial lens. They're seen as different in ways that are linked to race, and the fact they're underrepresented in valued, powerful decision-making positions sends the message that they're not expected to have power or influence, or even to belong to the same extent as white people. None of these attitudes are inevitable. They come about because of the messages we all absorb, and the function of these messages is to keep the social structure of racism going. These attitudes are learned, and once we recognise this, we can begin to unlearn them. In organisations like schools, individual and collective behaviour has a huge impact on whether racism can be prevented or allowed to continue. Everyday racism is named everyday racism because for many minority ethnic colleagues and learners, subtle interactions that reflect racism are a daily occurrence. It's important to create a safe environment where this can be talked about openly and worked through. Everyday racism has serious consequences for mental health, well-being and confidence, so we can't afford to be defensive about it. We need to be clear that the impact everyday racism has on someone is more important than the intention of the person who made them feel that way. This isn't about casting blame, it's about learning from each other and developing better relationships as a result. Decision-making behaviours are another important thing to look at on a personal and organisational level. Who is invited to particular meetings, asked to do valuable pieces of work, or called on for their opinion? Every interaction between staff and colleagues or staff and learners in a school adds to the creation of what behavioural psychologists call in-groups and out-groups. When we think about racism as a social structure, we can see that this in-group and out-group behaviour is compounded by the invisibility of whiteness. White people are unremarkable, not noticed. so you'll rarely hear people hint that they don't belong in certain positions or shouldn't be taken seriously on the grounds of race. You'll not hear people saying, "She got that job because she's white," or "He's got a chip on his shoulder about race because he's white." Even although where racism is at play, both of these statements could be true. When people aim comments about tokenism or playing the race card or all lives mattering at minority ethnic groups, this reinforces the sense that they are part of the racial in-group, along with fellow white people. Even if you're a white person and you don't share their views, this structure of racism will mean you benefit from being in the in-group whether you like it or not. Thinking about what the in-groups and out-groups in your school look like can help you to lead the way on embedding race equality. If minority ethnic people seem to be in the out-group, that's one thing you can change by making sure that there's no doubt they belong. You can make sure they are valued, included on an equal basis, and have a meaningful influence in your school.
She only got that job because she's white.
He's got a chip on his shoulder about race because he's white. She might not understand because of her white cultural background.
Talking about in-groups and out-groups might sound a bit too academic or technical. So when we're thinking about race equality, one of the easiest ways to consider this in practice is to think about the concept of culture. The idea of being part of a common ethnic or national culture is something we're all familiar with. Whether we're particularly invested in our culture or not, we all have an idea of what it is. Culture can be used to bring people together in a shared sense of who we are as a people, and that's often a thing that brings pride and belonging. But it can also be used to exclude, if too much emphasis is placed on who's seen to be like us and who is not. In a teacher training exercise developed by Gurun Pettersdottir, who's an Icelandic expert in intercultural education, groups of participants are asked to define the key features of their own culture. They then have to remove all of the features that they think some members of their cultural group might not think are important or might disagree on. As a member of the Scottish cultural group, is haggis important to me? Are bagpipes, tartan, shortbread? If I think the Christian religion is part of Scottish culture, do I think that's the Church of Scotland, or the Free Church, or the Presbyterian Church? No matter the cultural background of the participants, sometimes nothing's left at the end of this discussion. But if anything is left, it will be the same kind of fundamental human things. Family, home, and things like that. The message of this is that we don't necessarily share as much in common with members of our own cultural group as we think we do. But the things that really matter to us are things that we share as human beings. It's about breaking down stereotypes, and that's something essential to creating change on race equality in schools.
But what are your thoughts about what you've heard so far? How are you feeling right now?
And I strongly feel that racism needs to be taught from primary school all the way through until a young person can leave the education services in the UK. Summer 2020 brought a lot of attention towards racism after the death of George Floyd in America.
For me, race equality, fairness, and being respected and valued is important. I feel as though I should be treated the same as everyone else and have the same rights as every other child. My message would be to stand up for yourself and for what you think is right.
Black Lives Matter just as much as everyone else's do. I am disgusted by the abuse and racism I see on a daily basis. We have a voice. We need to start using it to change things for the better, and teach others to use their voice to change things for the better too.
As a young BME person, I want to feel safe in school. Teachers must discuss racism in class and evolve the topic from a taboo to a comfortable and safe topic for pupils and teachers. They must teach how racism should be dealt with and why it is wrong.
But I think the school like to play happy families a little bit.
We have our incidences, but they likely to brush them under the carpet a little bit. These kind of racism incidents. But I think there should be more awareness of it. There definitely should be more awareness of it.
Over the past 3 years, there have been 649 racist incidents reported in Glasgow City Council's schools, according to the Herald, which is a lot, but those numbers are skewed as pupils will avoid reporting incidents because they are not dealt with properly by teachers and staff. In order to make pupils feel safe, incidents must be treated properly and confidently by teachers and staff throughout.
I get uncomfortable with the word anti-racist. When you start using emotive words like racist or anti-racist, it evokes all kinds of different impressions on people. So we talk about the egalitarian side of things.
We deal with everyone in the same way. They come through the door, they're just part of this school, and it doesn't really matter what their background is.
These quotes from teachers are of great contrast to those of pupils. Teachers must be comfortable with using the term racist. How will pupils learn about racism if teachers aren't educated on the topic and aren't comfortable speaking on it themselves?
Often schools take the approach of celebrating diversity. This means using things like multilingual displays, assemblies, multicultural celebrations, involving parents in assemblies, and so on. What impact does this have?
I think celebrating diversity is definitely a very good idea. However, we need to involve everyone and make sure the school is very inclusive.
Celebrating diversity is really important, and it's really important that we don't miss the inequalities.
Celebrating diversity is a great way to avoid those hard, difficult conversations with parents, staff and children.
With a critical eye, we might say that celebrating diversity is a good way to avoid discussing race and racism meaningfully. That it allows us to feel positive about inclusion at the expense of challenging the structures of racism that prevent inclusion. In some cases, the way we celebrate diversity can reinforce perceptions of difference. Positive stereotypes are still stereotypes. Celebrating diversity can be part of our approach to making our schools more inclusive, but only if we're prepared to take on the serious work involved in changing our approach to race equality first.
Everyone has a right to feel equally involved. There is so much more we can do other than just celebrate diversity.
Celebrating diversity is a great way to avoid race equality.
It's insufficient for schools to celebrate diversity. How do schools develop a diverse curriculum that embraces an anti-racist approach and aims to improve the learning experience of all pupils? We've explored the necessity to go beyond celebrating diversity. Now, let's look at white privilege.
We've been engaged in a global conversation about race and racism. You've probably had discussions at home, at school, or at work, and in those conversations you've probably heard the term white privilege. You may have even had this term used in a way that felt like an insult or an accusation. Others will have told you that it's all just made up to make white people feel bad, and none of this is right. Privilege is a hard concept for people to understand, because normally when we talk of privilege, we imagine immediate, unearned riches and tangible benefits for anyone who has it. But white privilege, and indeed all privilege, is actually more about the absence of inconvenience, the absence of an impediment or challenge, and as such, when you have it, you really don't notice it. But when it's absent, it affects everything you do. There are lots of types of privilege out there. The privilege of being born into a wealthy family versus a poor family is kind of obvious, but then there's the privilege of being able-bodied versus having or acquiring a disability that most of us take for granted. I have two very close friends who are wheelchair users, and I'll be honest, when I first met them, I was completely ignorant about the everyday ways their lives are made harder through no fault of their own. Some of these ways are simply thoughtless, but some of them are just the way we live, just the way we build infrastructure, just the way everything works. That just makes their life harder than mine. That's just one of the ways that I'm privileged, and understanding that, embracing that, doesn't make me a bad person. But ignoring it raises the chance that my friends will be excluded in ways that are not obvious to me, and as their friend, I can't allow that. There's a good chance, as a white person watching this, your life is already hard. Every day you have to overcome some difficulty or challenge just to get by. But you can still have white privilege. White privilege doesn't mean you haven't worked hard or you don't deserve the success you've had. It doesn't mean that your life isn't hard or that you've never suffered. It simply means that your skin color has not been the cause of your hardship or suffering. There is nothing but a benefit to understanding our own privileges, white and otherwise. It brings us closer to those who are different. It helps us be vigilant about the ways we treat others different than us. It helps us make a society that is fairer and more equal. Having white privilege doesn't make your life easy, but understanding it can help you realize why some people's lives are harder than they should be.
So we can see how white privilege brings freedom from racist behaviour to the majority ethnic group, the dominant ethnic group, in our case, white Scots. It brings freedom from harmful stereotypes, from being considered different on racial grounds. It brings these freedoms for people considered white and their families, potentially over generations. Of course, not everyone has the same level of access to white privilege. For new migrants who are white, the impact of xenophobia and prejudice can limit that access to a certain extent. The majority ethnic group determines the level of white privilege, belonging and value placed on other white groups. Some communities, like Scottish Gypsy travellers and some Jewish communities, have arguably been racialised and might have fairly little access to white privilege. At one time, Italian Scots were considered not to be white at all, yet research shows that over a few generations they had become part of white Scottish society. Even new migrants from Italy are regarded positively. Yet so far, people in the 4th and 5th generation of Pakistani families in Scotland are still facing racism, because skin colour is such a strong marker of how people are perceived. So even where access to white privilege is limited, at its heart is the freedom to walk down any road in Scotland without the fear of being constantly noticed and possibly judged on the grounds of ethnicity. On a practical level, we can show clear evidence that white privilege exists just by looking at the differences in everyday experience between people regarded as white and people from black and minority ethnic groups. Two of the main signs of racism operating in society lie in the way that minority ethnic people are routinely both over-scrutinised and undervalued. Research for The Guardian newspaper showed that BME people in Britain were twice as likely to have faced abuse or rudeness from strangers in the last week, more than twice as likely to have been wrongly accused of shoplifting, and more than twice as likely to have been unfairly overlooked for a job or promotion. So how do we overcome this? We've shown that there are serious problems with racism in our society, and we know that this is tied up with power structures, keeping the same people at the top of the tree. It's not enough for us just to be non-racist on a personal level. To take leadership and create that change, we need to become anti-racist.
There's a big difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. I know it doesn't seem like it. I know that both of these things seem equally good, but they're not. Think of an interaction. I'm afraid you've probably had one, right? Where with somebody, maybe even somebody you respect, maybe even someone you love, who says something that's racist, does something that's racist, behaves in a way that's racist. Someone who's not racist, they won't say or do anything in that moment. They want to not rock the boat. They don't want to be upstanding. Instead, not racist, they tend to be bystanders. But afterwards, after the event, they'll find other people who are also not racist, and they'll talk to each other about, oh, that was terrible, that thing that happened the other day. I would never say anything like that. Anti-racists are different. And they come in all shapes and sizes. They come in all ages. Anti-racists are constantly looking around to say, what tools do I have available to make it clear that this is not acceptable? And this is what anti-racists do. It's not that they stand up at the dinner table when their uncle's a little bit racist and kick the turkey off. That's not it. But what they do is they say, "I'm sorry, Uncle John. That's not acceptable. That's racist." Quietly and respectfully. What they do is make sure that they never miss an opportunity to let the world know where they stand, even if they can't change everything. You're probably in a position where other people have a lot more power around you. I know how that feels. Sometimes we sit and we look around us and we think, how can I possibly change all this? And sometimes you can't. But what you can do is make sure wherever you go, people know where you stand. They know that you're an anti-racist. You become a beacon of light that way. You become someone who makes other people want to be anti-racist too. You've got tools at your disposal. Learn, read, and make everybody clear where you stand.
To create an anti-racist environment in schools, teachers have to address racist incidents and encourage anti-racist behaviours, which will in turn educate pupils and allow them to form a correct attitude on racism.
This video resource is just the beginning of a conversation happening across Glasgow schools. We've built up some of the understanding that we need to start leading on systemic change, and from here onwards we can start looking at practical ways to make the change. To create an anti-racist environment in our schools, we need to keep building our own capacity and confidence in these issues. We need learning approaches that develop intercultural competence. We need to work on addressing language and negative issues, and we need to make minority ethnic identities and voices visible and meaningful in the curriculum and the classroom. We need to look at approaches to prevent racism by creating attitude and behaviour change. Perhaps most importantly, we need to make it safe to talk about race and racism in our schools.
To make pupils feel safe, please take proper actions to educate on racism, treat incidents correctly, and create conversations with pupils and staff.
How do we make it easier for management, staff, pupils and the wider community to feel safe and confident to talk about racism? How can we become more empowered to be able to take appropriate actions in handling racism and discrimination in our schools in such a way that it makes a difference? What impact or difference would we want to see?
Hi. As we all know, treating each other respectfully is truly important, and that related topic is race equality. Race equality is all about treating each other the same way, whether our skin color or home country is. We should all play our part and support race equality.
One thing people need to know about racism, particularly head teachers, is that not everyone feels comfortable enough talking about their racist experience or something racist that just happened to them in school. And I feel like having a group to talk about this will really encourage people to actually speak up about their racist incident and actually have those issues be dealt with and not just swept under the rug, so people will actually feel safe talking about these experiences.
I am proud of my race. I want people to understand me, celebrate my race, and show love over hate. I deserve the same opportunity as my Scottish peers. All lives matter, so what are you doing to ensure equality for me?
We strive for equal rights in our learning community. We believe we should treat members of society as we treat our family members, with love, respect and tolerance. We are encouraged to stand strong and resist against evil acts of racism. We are aware of the society's prejudice and empowered to promote a positive change.
Racism hurts us more than we let on. It completely destroys our mental health. No one has the right to view or treat someone else as inferior.
Do what is right and confront racism.
Systemic change and leadership of race equality? Is it about how we handle racist incidents or individuals? Is it about the curriculum? Is it about diversity? It is about all of these things, but fundamentally systemic change in the leadership of race equality is about how we lead our organisations. The culture, the environment that takes on anti-racism from the top is crucial to systemic change in taking this forward.
As leaders, what do we need to do to implement systemic change in race equality?
We need to take forward systemic change, clearly with a focus on equality. We actually need to ensure the word inclusion is very often associated with equality. The two are very separate and very different. For me, inclusion is about learning and teaching, and equality is about fairness and justice.
Inclusion is about learning and teaching. Equality is about fairness and justice.
In consideration to systemic change across our organisation, we need to think about three things. We need to think about behaviours, we need to think about attitudes, and we need to think about the use of the word perception. In relation to behaviour, it's very easy to pick up on someone's inappropriate behaviour, and that can be challenged almost immediately and instantly. Handling somebody's attitude is very, very difficult and very different, and that is what we need to look at in terms of the systems and our leadership, and how we look to consider challenging these attitudes and creating positive and more anti-racist environments. The word perception is often associated with racism. How often have we used the word perception? Racism is not perceived. Racism is lived. We experience racism. I would urge consideration always to the use of the word perception. What's changed in the world in this 21st century? Quite a lot has changed. Young people are speaking out. Unfortunately, when it comes to racism and race equality, it looks and seems as though not a lot has changed. So we've got a lot of work to do that would actually enrich our organisations across the board.
How do we identify the attitudes that need to be challenged? How do we support people to make the change in their attitude?
Building on systemic change in the leadership of race equality is the key challenge here. We need to self-reflect. We need to think about our passions, our commitment and our responsibilities. We need to look at our procedures and our systems and our processes within our organisations to see and to ensure that we are being equitable and fair. We need to build the confidence of ourselves individually and organisationally to be able to take forward anti-racism in its widest sense. We need to be able to get it wrong, to get it right, and actually we need to walk the talk from the top. As an employer, I need to think about systemic change. As an employee, a member of staff, I need to think about systemic change. And as a service provider, we should all be thinking about systemic change. Leadership in all these areas is crucial. What we'd like to consider now are your next steps. What are you going to do to contribute to that necessary change in the leadership of race equality? Thank you.
The pain, the unfairness and the discrimination couldn't be any more explicit from today's presentation. It couldn't be any clearer, the challenges that we are all facing in many different ways. There's one question. It's a simple question, yet it's a big question. What can you do about this? What can we do about this? What are our next steps going to be to make this better?
Many thanks to all the staff and teams across Glasgow Education Services who cooperated in making this presentation. Thanks to the schools who helped bring this together, and all the secondary and primary school children and young people for their invaluable contributions. Special thanks to our key partners, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, CRER. This partnership work echoes the commitment to equality of everyone involved.